Welcome back to this special broadcast focusing on this year's World Economic Forum annual meeting, which is going to be held in Davos, themed Resilient Dynamism. Still with me in the studio is Dennis Dykes, he's Group Economist, Chief Economist, let me call the title right, at Nedbank. Mela Matola, CEO of Brand South Africa, and from a bureau in Cape Town, Dr. Ibu Sever, he is Executive Chairman of Sekunjalo Investment Group. Gentlemen, thank you for staying with me. I wanted to read from the agenda for 2013 before we started our conversation. I think it picks on what you've been talking about. It says, we live in the most complex, interdependent, and interconnected era in human history. And attached to that thought is what companies do in such an environment. Now, it has changed the dynamic from the past where perhaps your large corporations had advantage. And now increasingly we hear of smaller companies that are more nimble and able to make quicker decisions, being perhaps the right structures to be able to succeed in this environment. If we look at the company at the corporate level, what needs now to be done in order to be able to remain resilient, in order to be able to remain relevant in this environment? Let me start with you, Dennis.
Well, I think it has been a difficult time for companies. They've generally over the last couple of years been cost-cutting and trying to get their balance sheets repaired following the crisis. And I think that in many countries they are actually a lot more healthy at this point. So they've also had their models tested by natural disasters, for example, in Thailand, in Japan, and so forth. Where basically you have these production chains that are very dependent on certain areas of the world, and then you have natural disaster and you hit quite hard. So there's a lot of introspection that has to take place. The last factor, which is also changing quite rapidly now, is the way governments actually react to businesses, both big business, of course, and small business. So people are grappling to actually see the changing policy agenda. And I think it does go to what you're saying. Companies have to be very nimble. They have to actually be very mindful of the way that politicians are thinking in this environment, because politicians are incredibly defensive, having been voted out in many different countries. And big business in particular is not particularly popular. As was the case maybe prior to 2007, 2008. So it really does call for a lot of introspection, and I think we will see change over the next little while. But companies, that's the nature of the system. I think companies do adapt and are adapting already. Yeah,
one of the changes that we've seen is the mantle moving from the banks onto the technology companies, because in the past when we looked at the stock markets, when you looked at market capitalization and those kind of things, you found your banks were probably the most heavily capitalized, the mining companies as well. But now suddenly a technology company is the most valuable company in the world, Apple, though we have seen it come under pressure. So perhaps one of the issues that is beginning to come on the corporate agenda is innovation. Are we seeing that in Africa, Mila, if I can come to you?
No, I agree. We are seeing quite a lot of innovation on the continent, and I think we probably don't tell the story enough. I mean, if you look here on home ground in South Africa, well, we all have to tell the story, Godfrey. But if you look here at South Africa, the kind of innovations that are coming out of this country, it shows you, for an example, let's look at our winning the bid for the SKA. The square kilometer array, which we are going to share 11 countries and with Australia. It shows you the capabilities that we have as a country to be able to, go into those kinds of territories. I mean, that's one of the biggest projects that's going to really contribute significantly to growth in this country. But it is also when you look at individual entrepreneurs all over the globe. I mean, I was reading the other day that, in Silicon Valley, you have a lot more South Africans who are making it big there and coming up with the inventions that are really revolutionizing technology.
And we need to be documenting them.
Elon Musk. Yes, we need to be talking about them. So indeed, innovation, you see quite a lot of innovation on the continent, whether it's in financial services. You can talk about EcoBank and what they've done over 30 countries. So there is a lot of innovation that is coming out of the continent. It's about telling the story, but it's also about ensuring that we are able to create an environment where entrepreneurs with bankable projects that they can come up with are able to be supported to ensure that we grow small enterprises, but we also ensure that cycle of innovation, the virtuous cycle of innovation, skills and technology transfer happens as rapidly as we can.
Absolutely. Now, one of the items on the industry agenda at Davos is how to thrive when global competitiveness is increasingly driven by talent and innovation. Now, Dr. Seve, let me come to you, because in it is the whole issue around skills. Now, we know when we talk skills and we talk Africa, the two do not live together very well, because we are short of skills. But the bigger issue is that we are not doing enough to try and make sure that we grow the skills and we develop an environment in which skills are created. From where you sit, how big an issue is this across the African continent?
Look, Godfrey, there is no doubt that we've entered a period in humanity's history where there's a very strong nexus between technology, capital, and people. And in particular, when we talk about people, we're talking about skills development. Now, I think the old-fashioned way is to look at skills development without technology. Technology has become a huge enabler. There are today many free universities, if you like, online, or free education systems online, such as the Khan Academy, for instance. And we're seeing increasingly in Africa the use of technology as a means of developing skills. And we'll see that increasingly, because it's the nature of the globalized world that knowledge is no longer beholden to a few, and technology and globalized world has opened it up considerably. With regard to Africa's skills deficit, there's no question that there's a skills deficit on the continent. And there are three reasons for that. The first is that most of our brightest and youngest continue to be poached in developed countries, and are in fact driving, Miller just spoke about Silicon Valley. Out of the last 4 years, the top tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, the award was given to South African. And in fact, when they announced this year's award, they said, thank goodness it's not another South African.
It's not an African.
That's great that South Africans and Africans are developing such technology and innovation. What's not great is that those people are not based in our country and our continent. So, firstly, let's create a comfort zone for our young people and for our innovators and entrepreneurs. Let's make them understand that Africa must be home. Secondly, the responsibility. If you look at China's development, and in my capacity as one of the co-chairmen of the Global Growth Companies Board of the World Economic Forum, I was able to see the developments at the Summer Davos meeting of companies that have grown. I think, for me, an example of such amazing growth was that one of the Chinese companies, whereby they actually built a university alongside their business in order to be able to skill up their business, and now produce ridiculous, like tens of thousands of engineers. So, we've always seen skills development as being the core responsibility of public sector or government. We should move away from that. Our large businesses are sitting with a huge amount of capital, and if they want to be sustainable, and if they really want to grow, which makes good business sense for them and the continent, it's very important that those businesses start investing themselves in both the technical and professional skills required on the continent. That is the next big challenge for us, by the way, on the African continent. One is to grow our own timber in a very methodical, very clearly defined way, and secondly, to retain that timber. But we also have to make sure that we are also able to meet the expectations and aspirations of people. Just one other point I want to make in terms of skills development. Being from the south of the continent, we've always looked at the continent from, if you like, south upwards towards the north. And we've always tended to see South Africa as being the concentration of innovation and technology. What amazes me, and something which I'm truly delighted by, is the huge amount of innovation and skills development and professional expertise emerging from other sub-Saharan African countries. And I think if only we could expose ourselves more and more to that kind of skills growth, we'll see what is possible.
Yeah. So who takes the first step, though? Is it the governments? Is it the corporates?
Well, I'm a businessman, and at the end of the day, I believe that business must start investing in people. Business must start taking it very seriously, not just as a side aspect of the business, but a very core integration into the business strategy must be to take. In fact, yesterday I had a discussion with a financial journalist who spoke about, you know, quite correctly about performance of companies. And I was saying, well, what Africa and South Africa needs, South Africa and other African countries need, is a 10 to 20 year approach towards business, so that we understand that we have to spend a lot of money in skills development. Business has to spend that money, first of all. Secondly, we have to create a social compact between the employees and business. And thirdly, we have to implement a strategy for social cohesion. In the absence of that kind of an approach, Africa will not be able to achieve its real potential. But I'm confident that more and more business and government and other stakeholders will begin to realize the importance of investing in skills development as business on the continent.
Yeah, thank you. Let me move on to the other points that are on the industry agenda at Davos. The other one is how to ensure stable, sustainable and affordable supplies of critical natural resources. Then the third one is how to navigate a changing regulatory environment while pursuing new growth opportunities. I don't know, are there any issues there that pertain to Africa and African companies and the kind of issues that they should be dealing with? Mila, can I start with you?
Well, I think the point that I made earlier when you talk about regulatory issues still holds, in the sense that, as I said, we're seeing an increasing number of countries and economies on the continent looking at their regulatory frameworks, and all obviously with a view to ensuring that they can also grow their economy, but also to create an environment which is conducive for businesses. And if I bring it closer to home here, you look at the same issue in South Africa, that there's been significant changes that are aimed at precisely that. Whether you look at the New Companies Act and how that ensures that it's much easier, for instance, to set up here in South Africa, or whether you look at some of the strides we are making in terms of trying to bring costs down, whether it's port charges, bringing those down. I think there's a lot of work that's being done to really create an environment that is friendly to business. And to the extent that these issues are relevant and will form the base of some of the debates and discussions at Davos, we as South Africa are quite confident that we are taking the necessary strides to ensure that we not only create an environment that's conducive for doing business, but that we also putting in place proper response mechanisms to deal with any global shocks that may come. And if you look at the financial crisis, for instance, it's some of the interventions that were taken by our country that ensured that we were to some extent protected from those external shocks. So we believe that, from a South African perspective, there is quite a lot that we are doing. But as Iqbal said, it's important that business and government work more closely together, for instance, in ensuring that we can now implement the National Development Plan.
Now, the challenge for Africa, of course, is, we speak about Africa, we speak of 1 billion people, we speak of the $1 trillion GDP of the continent combined, etc. So we speak of these opportunities in commodities, etc. But these are 54 individual countries and 54 regulatory environments. And yet at the same time, when we sell it, we're trying to sell it like it's one market. How big an issue does regulation remain across Africa? And should we not perhaps, Dennis, be thinking about tackling this at the AU level and creating a commonality of some of these regulations, so that if a business person has dealt with a monopoly and mergers issue in Angola, the issue could be treated the same way, say, for instance, in South Africa or in Zambia?
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge there's still huge barriers between countries in Africa. Some of them are just physical, there's just no infrastructure. Some of them are actually through tariffs and so forth, and I think there's a lot of good work now going on to try and actually remove those.
There is?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've got this Eastern Seaboard agreement trying to actually, break down those tariff barriers, and I think that's very laudable. But there's no doubt, if you look at Africa as a region and you look at the amount of intra-African trade and so forth, it's not a coherent continent.
It is tiny because the numbers I was looking at suggest that, you know, Africans trade about 10% of the goods and services between themselves of their total goods traded with the world. Absolutely. Whereas the bulk of what we do, we send either to China or to Europe or to America. Whereas within the European community itself, I think the figure talks up north of 40%.
Absolutely. And in continents like South America, it's around about 20–25%. That sort of trade. Southeast Asia is even more interconnected, if you want to use that phrase. So there's just no doubt we've got a lot of work to do on the continent to make it a real region. And I mean, there's all sorts of historical issues around that, and we know the problems of the past. But we've got to really look forward now and start to say, are we really just talking about this? Or are we really making it happen? And unfortunately, there's still quite a bit of talking rather than actually the will to actually drive these things through. I mean, if you just look at energy, for example, we talk a lot about how there's a lot of potential in other countries and so forth.
Inga, we keep talking about
the Inga dam, ad nauseum, but when it comes down to the actual decision making, everyone just says, no, it looks a little bit suspect. We can't guarantee the supply and so forth. We must actually say, look, this is a massive natural resource. If we either must commit to it, or we must, just say, oh well, the other reasons why we can't do it.
I wish I'd brought someone from the AU here and been querying them and quizzing them about trying to create this interconnectedness that we keep talking about. We actually have one political voice, if you like, through the AU, but we're actually not translating that into action on the ground.
I mean, we spoke a little bit early on about the intervention in Mali by the French.
Why are the French in Mali?
Because our decision was that we'd go there in September, when basically all the fighting would have been over by then.
By foot, right?
So, I mean, it's just absolutely bizarre to take that sort of decision.
But Godfrey, just to add, something that Dennis said, if you look at the free trade area that he mentioned, to me, there is clear political will and intent. There's a clear deadline that's set to say by 2014 we should have made the following advances to bring those 26 countries together, at least at various levels. We will not achieve full integration, but the intent is there to bring those countries together. And what it does is it presents a very huge opportunity, obviously, for the individual countries to develop. I mean, the GDP of that entire region combined would probably in excess of $1.1 trillion US. And so the same thing we talk about the Inga Dam. There's, again, strides that are being made there in terms of commitments to really action these things. I think the critical issue we need, it's not to focus on developing more and more policies and plans, but to action what already is there. Act on the agreements that are already there.
But Mila,
that is what is required.
I've been writing about Inga for the past 10 years. I started writing about Inga way back when Mobutu Sese Seko was there.
Godfrey, we live in hope. We believe that there is clear intent and you can see political will. And so I'm saying that we really need to make it happen.
Okay, I'll take your point, but let's move on now and talk finally about the global agenda. Now, I'll just go through the 3 key points that the global agenda has at Davos this year, and I'll just outline them quickly for you. So how to get the global economy back on the path of stable growth and higher employment. And secondly, how to address persistent vulnerabilities within the international financial system. And thirdly, how to increase global, national and industry resilience to measure systemic and catastrophic risks. I'm beginning in Cape Town. What's your take? Is there a point that's missing there that you'd like to add before we discuss the merits of those points?
Just, Godfrey, I think looking at the world very simply today, the mess that we're in has been caused by the overspending of Europe and North America, and they've quite simply lived beyond their means. And I think it would be very unfair for other parts of the world, especially Africa, to now bear the consequences of the irresponsible financial behavior of Europe and North America. So that's my first point, because I'm an African, and yes, we live in a globalized world, but I'd like to believe that we should not be held responsible. In fact, the irony is that because Africa was to a large extent a cash economy in many parts of the continent, we were shielded by the kind of exuberance that was shown in Europe and North America. So I'd like to say that, look, you know, there's a problem, and of course the world is global, and of course it's going to affect us. I mean, lots of people spoke about decoupling, and you know, to an extent we can be decoupled, but as we've seen in the last year or two, it does affect us. I think, like with all good approaches, and these are the discussions in Davos, but with all good approaches and conferences and good intentions, what we as Africans have to do is we have to be very clear about our own agenda, and we have to be very clear about our own objectives. And I think we must not be afraid to put those agenda and those objectives on the table in the discussion sessions, in the panels, in the conference meeting, in the corridors at Davos. I think that Africa needs to assert itself. And I think the world at this point in time gives us that opportunity, not because you know, someone else is saying do it, but because the economics of the world is such that Africa is a place that can in fact develop to a large extent through its own initiatives over the next while, and I think we should take that opportunity. Yeah.
When I look at those 3 points, are there any really that you'd say Africa needs to look at there? Are there things that worry Africa, Dennis? Financial systems?
I think you mentioned... Sorry.
Okay, go on quickly.
I think you mentioned earlier, Godfrey, the issue of, I would say, sort of tariff protection or national protection. I think the biggest concern to us as Africans is, you know, if developed economies in Europe and North America start implementing approaches to prevent the export of our products and all those kinds of things. So I think tariff protection or all sorts of protectionism, not so much on the African continent, but protectionism in other parts of the world is one of the biggest threats facing our continent and our countries.
Yeah, so protection should have been on the agenda. Dennis?
Well, I think protectionism is on the agenda, certainly when it comes to Africa as well, and I think that we've got to be very wary ourselves of implementing protectionist measures to keep others out, because that's when you lead to all sorts of atrophied systems developing and higher costs and so forth. So I think that's a big trap to actually avoid. I think also one must acknowledge that Africa is not just one country and that there are many different sort of circumstances. South Africa is actually in a in-between sort of situation. We have actually had a measure of overspending. We are running a massive current account deficit at the moment. We do have high levels of consumer debt. The financial system was very resilient during the global financial crisis, so fortunately that is a vulnerability that I don't think is necessarily there. But we've got to actually be careful that we don't continue in the path of others where they've made the mistakes of thinking that things can continue for a long period of time. So I think different African economies will have different agendas and different vulnerabilities, but we've got to acknowledge our own and take remedial steps.
Absolutely. I need your final thoughts now as we come to the end of this debate. If I can start with you, Mila, your final thoughts in terms of the message that you expect will come out of WEF, but that you suspect will come out.
Well, before I touch on that, I just want to say one of the things we should take to WEF as South Africa is that, you know, issues around the financial system is certainly not one of our vulnerabilities. In fact, if anything, it's one of our strong points. And I think it's a message that we need to put across, whether you look at, you know, our financial markets, etc., and how we rank. Those are issues that we need to put very squarely on the table and really make a case for how then that presents a good opportunity to invest through South Africa or to use South Africa as a, you know, a services hub, a financial services hub, and I think that message needs to come across. With regard to what one is missing, I would rather focus on what we need to take forward, and I think for us the critical issue is our national development and the infrastructure build program that we are launching in this country, which we believe is one of the best ways in which we are going to respond to the changing global environment and to any external shocks. We are creating an environment within which we can be able to ensure greater economic growth, and then we can deal with our own vulnerabilities, which are around the area of employment, of inequality, and education. So we are taking the message that we have a plan, we are putting the plan into action to ensure that we can resist those external shocks and we can remain a resilient economy on the African continent.
Okay, the hopeful continent. Dr. Seve?
I'd like to see that Davos is able Davos is able to deliver to us a greater position in terms of where Africa stands. I'd like to see Africans at Davos playing a greater role, but more importantly, I'd like to see technology transfer into Africa and innovation being promoted with companies in Davos and companies on the continent. I'm going there with a very specific agenda, and that is to ensure that we are able to bring a lot of technological solutions to the continent in very many different sectors. And most of my meetings in Davos next week are centered around how we do that in support of the African continent's economic and social development.
Thank you. Dennis, quickly.
Yeah, I think very quickly, I think Africa is very solidly on this agenda, and there's much opportunity for Africa to state its case. I think for South Africa, this is a key meeting because we have to state our case very, very clearly after a year of terribly negative press. So we've got to get our story correctly together, and I'm encouraged that now we've adopted the National Development Plan in all its entirety, that we will take that forward and gain support amongst the international community.
Absolutely. I must thank my guests, gentlemen. Thanks very much. Dennis Dice from Nedbank, Mila Matola, CEO, Brand SA, and Dr. Iqbal Seve from Second Jali Investment. Thank you very much indeed for watching our special pre-WEF live debate. Remember, us at CNBC Africa will be there, and we are going to be crossing live every single day from Davos to our studios here in Johannesburg, where we'll be talking to some of the world leaders and covering it in every aspect. Of course, we also have a special debate on the 23rd of January, where we're talking de-risking Africa and reducing the risk of doing business with the leaders of Africa's two biggest economies, as well as its richest men, plus, of course, our Indian investors from Bharti International. Thank you very much indeed for watching. From me, until next time, goodbye.